everyone. Welcome to the FWN webinar this evening, where we're here to talk about the US elections. We're here to talk about, we're here on the eve of the US election, I should say. We're here to talk about Kamala Harris in particular, women, representation, and what happens next. I'm really honoured to have this incredible panel here. It is an all woman of colour panel. That didn't happen by accident, by the way, everybody. So joining us this evening is Nandy MP for Wigan and also Shadow Foreign Secretary. Thank you for being here, Lisa. We know how busy you are, but very delighted to have you here this evening. And we have Professor Singh, who is in London, who is a writer, an academic, a speaker, an activist, and a full-on awesome sister who I'm very lucky to have known for a number of years, and has also has very strong connections to the US. And joining us from New York is Sydette, who is an activist and a public speaker and much more. So for the purpose of this evening, we've got a hashtag, which is hashtag FWN POTUS. So FWN POTUS is the hashtag. And we're just going to set the scene very briefly. So as we know, the US election is being held tomorrow on Tuesday, November the 3rd. To say this is a momentous moment, I think is a slight understatement. We know this word unprecedented keeps being used over and over again. So sometimes it doesn't really have the kind of meaning that we want it to have, but this is an unprecedented election. So it would be a momentous election full stop, given what we've seen already with the Trump presidency. But as we know, we are in a pandemic, and in the US, more than 96 million people have already cast their vote, which is extraordinary. And it says something about people's belief in democracy, despite everything that's going on. We also know that in the US, devastatingly, the country has the highest rate of COVID-19 deaths in the world, and the numbers of people being infected by the virus is rising. We also know that disproportionately Black people, people of colour, who are again disproportionately on low incomes, are being impacted the most. And we also know that what happens in the United States of America matters around the world, and it very much influences the rest of the world. So here in the UK, we are also going through a pandemic. On Thursday, we have our own second national lockdown starting. The UK has got one of the highest COVID death rates in Europe. We're currently 46,853 people have died. Obviously, every single person who's lost their life matters to the people who cared and loved for them. These are not just figures. We're also going through many crises, political crisis. I'm going to sadly have to mention the Brexit word again. I know some people thought that we didn't have to talk about that again, but we've got a Brexit transition period happening, which is in place until December the 31st. And if the EU and the UK don't reach a deal, then we will be heading towards a no-deal Brexit. So the outcome of the US election matters. It matters hugely, obviously, to the residents and citizens of the USA, but it also matters deeply to us. We know that Britain has a long-standing so-called special relationship with the US, and so it matters. So alongside this framing, I also need to mention the huge Black Lives Matter global movement for racial justice, which has been reignited this year. We have seen those incredible protests across the United States. We are seeing doubling down of white supremacy and much more going on. So that is also part of the backdrop. So this is a framing of our discussion this evening. We've got an excellent panel, so I'm going to stop talking in a moment. But just one other quick point. We're also here to connect what's happening in the US to the left and the Labour movement and the Labour Party here in the UK. What does it mean for Labour, and what kind of cues should we be taking from what's happening in the US? So without further ado, Sydette, I'm going to hand the microphone over to you first, because you are in New York. So we'd like to get an idea of what is it like today on the eve of the US election, and also for you to give us your contribution in terms of the framing of tonight's discussions. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I would like to first say that I am in New York, but I am originally from a place called Far Rockaway, which is where I am now. And that is very important for me to mention, because one of the things that is most indicative of this moment is the difference of experience between people who are in places like Far Rockaway or the Appalachians or Southeast LA versus people who live in similar cities, but completely different experiences of like the Upper West Side, the central areas of the South, and Beverly Hills. It's more than ever, these election is indicative of a grand schism between the haves and the have-nots. It is a grand schism between those at the margins and those at the center. And the election of Kamala Harris is often talked about in terms of representation. This would be the first Black uh, vice president, Black woman VP. It would also be the first South Asian American VP. That is often a thing that is left out. But what is happening is that we are looking at a constant feel of brinksmanship. So we are looking at politics that happen after people are pushed to a really uncomfortable level. So Americans needing the ACA and having that rescinded, the pandemic, the lack of change in living wage for what is it, like 30 years, that has completely been outpaced by cost of living. And we are doing this all, as impended on every sentence, in the middle of a pandemic. What is happening here is that there are nearly 8 million Americans who have filed jobless claims, who are not working. Food insecurity is higher than ever. Right now, tomorrow's the last day of the election. It's not the election day, so people have been voting. As you said, 96 million people have already voted. There are states where they are already hit their voting totals. And what we are looking at is that has happened, and people have tried to run the campaign buses of Joe Biden off the road. And on the other hand, those same attempts have been made in Black neighborhoods in places like Fort Worth, Texas, and those people are turning them around because specifically Black people of American slave descent have been dealing with this as a regime, as an authoritarian regime. This has been something that has happened in their lives and in my life as a first generation Black immigrant, as a Black person in America for years, centuries. That has to be a grounding here because the same tactics that have been used in terms of colonialism and racial oppression here are used around the world, and specifically in places, India, Jamaica, Kamala Harris is from. Those are the same places that have shaped this politic. And what we are looking at is when people ask me what I'm most concerned about for Kamala Harris, I am concerned because she is a Black woman, an Asian woman, an Indian woman, American running for office in a world that does not like her. But I am more concerned for her constituents and for the groups of people that she has either chosen to or been chosen to represent. How are their lives? Because rather than representative, that is, as a politician in America with a guaranteed healthcare, guaranteed food, guaranteed income, that is a level of safety that most of the people who share identities with her do not have. And the choices she will make will be deeply covering those people who are at the most risk for COVID and are the most risk to be pushed out of professions. One of the big problems we have now, and I think that is a real problem with the solidarity and the actual building, is that Black women between the ages of 25 and 44 are most likely to be pushed out of journalism. So even in the reporting and the sharing, we do not have representatives or people who would be like Kamala Harris in the places that are supposed to be sharing this information. And that I got from an open news study. Open News is an org that works in the States. And what I hope that we can talk about and what I would like to open up to the rest of the panel is how do we move going forward, understanding something beyond representation as in brinksmanship or the glass cliff, that women of color, women in general, marginalized people get platformed, start to get recognition only when things are so bad the other option is mutual death assured fascism. Because what these moments assure us is that we do not have a working government. We have a collection and corroboration of things that happen. But if every time there's an election, the choices are presented as elect this person or die, how do we move to a point where we start giving people the right to thrive, taking care of people at their basic needs, and thinking of the people who are elected not as the number one figureheads or a celebrity, but as people who are charged with taking care of people and people whose experiences are within the same experience of their constituents.
Thank you, Sydette. for that really powerful and sobering introduction to tonight's discussion. Thank you, and thank you for posing those really powerful questions as well. So Sonny, over to you.
Okay, well, first of all, I think I'm just going to second and third and fourth and fifth everything Sydette said. So I'm not going to go back and cover that ground, but I think what I wanted to think about is build a little bit from what she said and think about the idea of how Kamala Harris is indicative, I would say very clearly not representative, and I'll come to that in a bit, of this glass cliff phenomena, but also how she's a fault line of, and in many ways embodies the fault line on multiple forms of exclusion, marginalization, oppressions, even though she may not necessarily individually experience all of them at the same time, and how her constituents, the often considered K-hive on social media, how often they project that sense of self and feel that kinship, and how complex that is for someone like her. In some ways, she has the Black Panther problem. She will never be everything to everyone. She can't. And yet what we do need to think about is what has been said. So I'm very fascinated, for example, here is a daughter of two immigrants. And if we just go back 12 years to the election of, the first election of Barack Obama, the American dream, the immigrant dream was held up, and he was sort of held up as a symbol of that. And yet that entire story has been entirely removed, or almost, very downplayed, if not entirely removed. There is no coming to America immigrant story when it comes to Kamala Harris. There is something else, and Sydette mentioned she's going to be, if things go well, the first Black woman to be vice president, the first South Asian woman to be vice president. And I find it very interesting to think about the fact that there is a far-right regime at the center of India and Indian government. Even 5-10 years ago, a South Asian running for the second highest office in America would have been covered with great enthusiasm and joy. That has not been the case with Kamala Harris and in the Indian press. There have been pieces, but somehow she embodies not so much as the achievement, often held up aspirationally for brown, upper caste men who make it to America. She's on the other side. Yes, she's her mother was upper caste, but she's the one who comes to America. She makes a series of decisions which are seen in South Asian communities, which have huge amounts of embedded internalized racism as deeply problematic. So she doesn't do the aspirational thing of marrying a white man, having children with a white man. She finds her solidarity, her relationship with another fellow immigrant from a former colony, from Jamaica. Now, these are fault lines that we aren't talking about. And even though this is happening in America, this impacts all of us, because in so many ways, she holds all of these fault lines within herself. And whether we like it or not, these are issues that will come up. And I don't want to go through many, many names, which will be familiar to people in this room. But women leaders in Britain are in the same space, very similar space. In some cases, they are deracinated, so they cease to be women of color enough. In other cases, that racination is fetishized and weaponized against them. And I think this is important to start thinking about if we are going to move to some kind of a functioning government that Sydette's talked about. And I also want to just think about one last point before handing it over, and we can come back to these ideas. Why is it, and how is it, that we are able to demand and require women of color, especially, and Black women in the US, but also here in the UK, and in India, the most marginalized, most vulnerable, which is Dalit and Muslim and otherwise minoritized women, to also at the same time bear the burden of keeping democracy going and being the bulwark against fascism. So I think what we should be talking about is the impossibilities of the weight that is borne by primarily women in these three democracies, especially those who are minoritized in different ways, and then what it means to be, in some ways, from those communities and be indicative then as a leader. Because we've constructed an impossible dilemma for not just the constituents, but also any of the indicative leaders. I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you, Sunny. Very thought-provoking and a very compassionate analysis, which is what you're known for. You're known for your compassion. So thank you for that. Lisa, I'm going to hand straight over to you.
Thanks very much. And I found that absolutely fascinating, listening to particularly the parallels drawn out between the UK and the US. I'm not in any sense as expert on US politics as Sydette or Sunny, but just listening to that as somebody who is half Indian, my dad comes from Calcutta, and reflecting on the very different experiences that people like myself, Diane Abbott, Rosanna Allen Khan, who've all spoken about those experiences and the way that we've been treated. We've been treated very, very differently in politics for very different reasons. And it's extraordinary, actually, when you think about what rests on Kamala Harris right now, and in a way feels that she's being somehow set up to meet a series of ambitions and a diversity of expectations that no one individual could possibly hope to meet. And I suppose, you know, somebody who finds it very inspiring to see her in the running to potentially become the vice president of the most powerful country in the world, that is a very, very sobering thought as we go into the next critical few days. And I suppose sort of brings me to where I was going to start, which was thinking about, from a UK perspective, what all this means, and also thinking about how much is at stake in this election, not just at stake about who is the incumbent of the White House, but what actually that team is able, not just willing, but also able to do in that role. It's really difficult to think of an election where more has been at stake, particularly for women. And I think it is right to say that there are two very different visions that are currently on offer for women, not just in the United States, but actually for women around the world, given the US's role as a leader. You know, the vacuum of that global leadership, I think we've all felt over the last 4 years. I've watched, not just in the UK, where this has been a process underway, but also in the US, over the last few years, where on both the domestic front and globally, the situation for women has significantly worsened in recent years. We've had a rowing back on the rights and the opportunities for women, especially in relation to women's rights globally, and the actions of the Trump administration around the funding that the US makes available, and particularly at the United Nations. The attacks on the World Health Organization, I think, have been particularly problematic for the women's global health agenda. We've seen cuts to foreign aid and development spending in the United States, which has a by far disproportionate impact on women and girls, and a signal that under an incoming Trump administration that is likely to continue to be a priority. On a domestic front, we've seen a rowing back on women's rights and particular impact on women of colour, and not just on policy but on leadership as well. What the US does has reverberations around the world. And what we've seen happening in the US has spread to the UK too, where we've seen a rise of these strongman leaders with very machismo ways of behaving at the very moment when it feels that the world most needs to come together and work together to combat a global pandemic. What we've seen is the breaking apart of countries and the breaking apart of within countries, and the politics of division at the moment when we most need to see exactly the opposite sort of leadership. The Black Lives Matters protests in the United States are obviously indicative of that and the way that they were handled. But we saw that too in the United Kingdom as a consequence, this sort of constant deliberation on trying to stoke culture wars, the attempts by the Prime Minister to turn the protests in Bristol about whether we're a country that believes that we should celebrate slavery into a debate about whether we should tear down a statue of Winston Churchill. As my colleague David Lammy said, the only person in Britain talking about Churchill is Boris Johnson. So you compare that with what the Biden-Harris administration and the policy offer around that for women. We're likely to see an end of the global gag rule that prevents the United States government funding organisations that support safe access to abortion, which will be a real game changer for a lot of women around the world. An incoming Biden administration is likely to restore aid and development as a central plank of US foreign policy with a renewed focus on global health and women's rights. I strongly suspect there'll be an attempt to appoint more women to key positions in foreign policy and national security. And one of the stated priorities of a Biden administration is reducing gender-based violence. This is important because the UK was actually under the Conservative Party, under William Hague, was one of the key countries that put that on the global agenda. But as our foreign policy in the UK over recent years has become collapsed into an obsession with chasing growth and trade deals, we've seen that values-based approach to foreign policy fall apart and that agenda fall backwards on a global front. So this would be a real game changer for women. But how much and what it means for the UK, I think, depends very much on the outcome. I just wanted to take those in turn quickly, if I may. I mean, a second-term Trump administration for the UK, I think, very clearly means that we will have to rethink an approach that has not delivered for Britain and has not delivered on many of the values that we want to see advanced around the world. We will always have shared interests with the United States of America on security, foreign policy, defence, cooperation, on tackling climate change. There'll be all sorts of areas where we need and must have a constructive relationship with the United States. But if we get a second-term Trump administration, I think it's clear that the UK government will now have to change course. And whilst we'll continue to work as constructively as possible with the United States, I think we'll have to look elsewhere beyond our shared interests for shared values and build values-based coalitions with those countries who want to see those values advanced in the world. The problem for the UK, of course, is where to look. We've gained a reputation around the world as an alliance breaker, not an alliance maker. We've been busy trashing our relationships with our closest friends and allies in Europe. So whilst we can look to countries like Canada for support on ending violence against women and girls globally, there is no future for the United Kingdom without looking closer to home for those shared relationships and those values-based coalitions. Just a very quick word on Brexit, if I may. I think there is a view in the UK government that a Trump administration would mean that a no-deal Brexit is not a problem for Britain. Because a trade deal with the US would be on offer. I have to say, in the conversations that I've had with the Trump administration over the last few months, with Cllr and myself, I think it's very, very clear that the Trump administration would be more than happy to do a deal with the UK, but they very much see that as a deal that is based on their interests, not necessarily ours. And so if I were the government, I would think very, very carefully about putting all their eggs into one basket. The truth is that a trade deal with the EU gives us greater, not less, leverage with the United States under a Trump administration. And I don't need to tell the Fabian Society Women's Network this, but obviously a no-deal Brexit outcome would have the worst impact for women because of the economic downturn, which always impacts women more, but also because of the associated impacts on social care and other sectors, which are absolutely critical for women. The last thing I would say is that for a Biden administration, there is no question that a Biden administration would be a game changer for the United Kingdom and for the world. But I don't think that many of those issues that I just talked about the situation of women globally here in the UK and in the United States, are the issues on which the US election are going to be fought, won and lost. COVID is a much more pressing issue for many American voters, law and order and other issues. So if Biden wins, I suppose one of the lessons I might offer up from the United Kingdom and the very difficult few years we've had as progressives here over the last decade is that if he wins the election, he then has to win the argument with the American people for those progressive values. No American president has ever strayed very far from the boundaries of public opinion. And for foreign policy to be legitimate, it has to be rooted in the consent of the people. So the argument has to start and not stop the day that you win an election. And to a large part, what a Biden-Harris administration is able to do for women will depend on their ability to win that argument on a domestic front. Now, that is really hard because he will be taking office in the midst of what is likely to be the worst economic downturn for over a century. And in an era of insecurity, as Sydette said, solidarity is a very, very difficult thing to build. Also in the global context, he faces probably the most challenging situation that the United States has ever stepped into. We've seen not just the gridlock of global institutions like the UN, the G20, the G7, but we've also had actions on a world stage from our global leaders that have actually made that worse in recent years. From a United Kingdom point of view, what does that mean? It means that we're critical in all of this because the UK has to step forward and provide an ally to an incoming Biden administration to get that decision-making process in those global institutions unblocked, to unequivocally support the agenda around advancing women's rights globally. And yet here we are, global Britain cut adrift from our closest friends and allies, with very little ability and leverage to do that here and around the world. We're left in the worst of all strategic positions, where the Biden administration has already signalled that the relationship with the UK is incredibly strained. So very little influence with the incoming United States administration, but also very little influence with friends and allies in Europe as well, and very little leadership shown on these issues in recent years. What do I think the upshot of this is? I guess I would say this, but I think that the Labour opposition is incredibly important because it is in our interests, all of our interests, to see Britain succeed, to see that relationship with a Biden administration built, strong and lasting, so that we can pursue not just shared interests with the United States, but shared values as well. And that's why we've been reaching out to our friends and allies in the Democratic Party over recent months to build those relationships, because on all of those issues that I mentioned for women, a partnership between a United States and a United Kingdom that are allied, not just on interests, but on values as well, would be a real game changer for the world.
Lisa, thank you so much for that very, very detailed and comprehensive overview, which very much helps us understand even more deeply what's at stake. Sydette, Lisa very clearly has outlined the implications of this election on the UK. We have been hearing about the many, many challenges that are out there, but I'm also very interested in hearing about the resistance to what's been going on for a very long time, but has been accelerated under the Trump administration in relation to the rights of women. And I know you are someone who works very closely with many minoritized, marginalized people. So I was wondering if you could give us a bit of an overview of where, regardless of what happens when the result comes in, what is happening in relation to, you know, community groups and organizations mobilizing, what kind of response do they need from us in the UK You to unmute yourself, Sydette.
The one thing I hope that happens is we start getting used to what it means to be on a Zoom meeting, because everybody at least once a conversation forgets you're on mute or forgets the camera's on or forgets to turn it off. I think for me is I pull back to the things of this is the best work is being done by people who have had to do this work all their lives. And the best work is being done by the people who learn from those people who are doing it. So one of the very interesting things is a lot of the activism I do is now inside the house because of the pandemic. So it's boosting, it's platforming, it's kind of citizen journalism as done by the populace is very important. That is how we are sharing. That is how we are using and doing things, sharing hashtags. Also, and as well, the separation between what is marketed and said versus what is done is super important, because the most inspiring things that I have said have been led by Black women in the South to me. If you want to look at what really should be the model for the world, I would say it's Black women in the South, because it is often the least supported, the most tokenized, the most used as representation, but not funded, not supported. So Black women in the South have been talking about voting rights and voter registration since, as far as I can remember, 2008 and earlier. But the Voting Rights Act comes down in like 2016. We start to watch this hollow out, and it becomes well, now we're going to talk about this extensively. But without fail, you have these women, you have these marginalized communities, also very strongly LGBTQI, people of color, specifically Black activism, people who are multiply marginalized, who are focusing not just on the vote, because the other thing we're dealing with deeply is such a crisis of faith, or a reckoning of faith within these institutions, is that people who are not doing this, they are concentrating on mutual aid. One of the things that I focus on is community fridges that have popped out all across America, which have featured members of the community putting food in working refrigerators, being supported by local businesses who let them run the power, who do drops, community farms. This is the focus I think that will have to come. We have to get to a very material focus. In terms of larger policy, one of the things that I think is important to mention is really looking at, Lisa talks about how these things are hitting, is that to provide some context, 1 million women, by the last thing I read, I believe it was in the New York Times, have already pulled out of the job force. Women are least likely to be paid. Which women are pulling out of the job force? The ones who least likely have childcare. Overwhelmingly Black, Latinx, Indigenous women are having the highest rates of COVID death. Latinx communities in New York are having the highest rates of COVID death. Every single child they believe that has died from COVID has been Black or Latin. That is the reality, and that is where the work is coming from. And the high note, the thing that keeps me going, is that there has never been a moment when I have done what I think is consciousness raising, and that is specifically where I am, because I'm not in the streets organizing in a lot of ways. And I think it's important to have that idea, because we need to have a solid mapping of where people are and what fits and what we are doing, because we are taking over a lot of the things that have been abandoned by governments. And I think that is an important thing to think, because what I feel, something Lisa said, is that there is we're pulling away, or Britain is pulling away. And I think that specifically looking distinctly at 3 countries, the US, the UK, Brazil, we might be pulling away. And I would actually also add in India, another rising fascist countries, is that we might be pulling away from the larger consensus of other places, but they're talking to each other. Boris Johnson and Donald Trump are talking to each other. Now, Farage did his work on both sides of the pond. They're talking to Bolsonaro. All of these peoples with these white nationalist ideologies are coming together to isolate others. These are part of the realities of what's happening. And resistance is coming with that in mind, of other people coming together. So we have to look at those allegiances as well, because they're going to be a very strong part in it. And as an American, I'm a first generation American as well, I am from Guyana. My family's from Guyana. So my family's from the former Commonwealth. But to also talk deeply about how there are privileges and access afforded to me as a first generation immigrant in these places, and other people who are first generation that would not be afforded to American born Black people. and why that happens, and why has the focus of a lot of these places within their specific contexts. So American-born Black people here, British-born Black people and Americans in the UK, Black people in Brazil, of why those are the direct targets, because that is where these people are building power. And going back to what Sunny says, these are the people who are standing as the bulwark against all of this. And what gives me hope is the idea that there is a desire to continue standing, but what I think is something we cannot avoid in the upcoming future is, how do we move beyond just what are these men and leaders of questionable morals and questionable vision doing, but how are we building together? And more importantly, how do we have a history of building together that was not discussed before but needs to be discussed now? Because just as awful as this has been, as quickly people and communities have activated to try and mitigate that. And that kind of power is what I'm interested in seeing for after, because that I think is what we'll have to hold up and what will take us through.
Wow, Sydette, that's incredible. Listening to you, I was getting goosebumps because I was thinking about how different and real solidarity is when it's coming from this place of shared humanity and connecting humanity. Lisa rightly mentioned the culture wars earlier. I know, Sunny, this is something you do a lot of work on as well, countering the culture wars, I should say. And then, you know, I think often very minoritized and marginalized people get dragged into identity politics, which is a scourge, and it's not allowing us to build this level of deep solidarity that's needed. So thank you for bringing that to this discussion. I'm going to pass the mic back to Lisa because Lisa needs to leave in a few minutes. And Lisa, I've got a question here as well from someone who's participating in tonight's webinar. The question is basically asking, how realistic is it to be a Black or minority ethnic woman in any future leadership ticket? So alongside your closing remarks, it'd be great to hear you there, and then we'll go on to you, Sunny.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm sorry that I have to leave. I'm finding this fascinating. You might have heard me saying as you all came in that I've got childcare problems as usual. I just wanted to, I guess you very kindly read that question out, but I've just looked at the front of it, the start of the question, and it was very much in the context of me having lost the Labour leadership contest. You very diplomatically, Shaista didn't mention that bit, which was kind. I guess I would just say my experience of going through that process was that one thing that I took a decision to do quite early on was to lean into the fact that I am a half Indian woman standing to be leader of a party that's never had anyone who looks or sounds like me leading it. And I took that decision after years really in Parliament of feeling like I didn't want to be defined by all of those things. They matter to me. They're part of my personal history and identity. I'm very proud of my family, but I remember being elected in 2010 and feeling quite frustrated that many of the men that I was serving alongside were able to go and talk about the future of the economy, about foreign affairs, and I was being asked constantly about what it was like to be a woman in politics, and I just found it incredibly frustrating to have to be defined by it. I kind of changed my mind along the way because I felt that it was important to be able to embrace that part of your identity and to show what it brings, to have a different perspective on power to other people who have traditionally been the incumbents in those roles. And so I leaned into it during the contest, and I found it in many ways a very heartening experience, but in some ways quite a frustrating experience. The thing that I found most frustrating, to be honest, was the common refrain that you don't look like a prime minister, which was code for you're not a white man. And that was frustrating because to be in a contest where there is absolutely nothing you can say or do or be that would persuade people to vote for you, some people, not all people, that was frustrating. That was the part that I found really, really difficult. And speaking to other women in British politics who've been through similar things in my party and quite recently in other parties as well, I think that's a shared common frustration. Where is the hope though? I guess the hope is that there was a big age divide, big generational divide in that. Younger women definitely sort of flocked to our campaign. I think many mixed race younger women felt a sense of identity with some of the things that I was talking about, and I learned quite a lot from them and gave voice to it during the campaign. I think what was really striking about that is that they felt that it was possible for someone like them, and therefore someone like me, to be in that role. Whereas for some of the older women, I think there was just a sense of, we'd love you to do it, but we just don't know if it's possible. And so if that is starting to change, and I felt that feeling that, you know, women can occupy positions like that, that is something that is starting to change in the Labour movement, then it makes me feel quite hopeful about what comes next. It's frustrating that we're not there yet. But, you know, I look at people, I mean, not to embarrass you, Shaista, but, you know, I look at people like you, you know, flying the flag in local communities around the country for Labour. You are the face, the voice of Labour in your local community. You're the people that are looked to for leadership. And I feel that that is, in the end, like Sydette talked about, you know, the Black women in the South who are doing this amazing work in America. That is how this is going to change in the end. So do I feel frustrated? Yes. Do I feel optimistic? Absolutely. And, you know, what's happened in the Labour Party since has really given me heart as well, because it wasn't just that, you know, some of our members recognised how important that was. The person who won that contest, Keir Starmer, recognised how important that was. We said in the contest we would be a team, and we absolutely are a team, and it's important to him. It's as important to him as it is important to me. So that gives me, you know, the Australian Prime Minister, Ben Chifley, once said that Labour has to be the light on the hill for people in times of darkness. These are very dark times indeed, and sort of to return us to where we started, representation isn't everything, but it does matter, and Labour's got to get it right on both fronts.
Well, thank you, Lisa. We know you need to go, but we very much appreciate that you were here and that you listened and engaged, and thank you. And you've got a big job to do, and we wish you well. And we hope we can invite you back to another Fabian Women event. So take care, and thank you for being here. Sunny, over to you.
Gosh, okay. I like the fact that you've said over to me, no question, so it could be anything. I actually do want to pick up on something that I think so much that's really struck me, and something that Sydette said about how these strong men with few morals and much greed and power and mediocrity are talking to each other. And yeah, right at the start of the Democratic nominations process, I was really struck by the level of excitement and support, and in fact, monetary support that someone like Tulsi Gabbard received from Indians, and obviously far right. And I think that there was a wonderful report in an Indian outlet that actually talked about her funding regime. And that was part of why she kept going when there was nobody voting for her. Nobody was interested. And I think that's one of the places we need to really consider, that these are the far right white supremacists with the power adjacency of Hindu Savern upper caste supremacists are talking to each other. They are liaising, they're connecting, they are coordinating, they're learning from each other. And for me, I think one of the key challenges coming forward, or going ahead, I mean, you know, coming in the coming months, will be how we counter this, not in individual nations, not in silos, whether they're not by national boundary or ethnic backgrounds or cultural formations. We need to figure out how to connect and form that solidarity internationally as well. I think here it's really crucial. I was saying this earlier before we, I think, kicked off, that I find hope in the US, and I find hope in India. I find hope in Brazil, where I also have family. Sort of all the places I have that I'm connected to seem to be going up in flames, which is a bit worrying. Because these are places where I can see active, ongoing mass resistance. For every, you know, what Sydette said, you know, when you've got white supremacists going into Black neighborhoods, you've got people pushing them back. But more than that, there's this incredible groundswell on multiple levels of resisting. What I find really disheartening in some ways is we've seen Labour lose ground steadily, and often in ways that didn't need to happen. But I think a lot of it is also that there isn't the same groundswell. I think Britain and a lot of Britons, and especially white Britons, can be very, very smug about how, oh, look, it's happening over there. You know, I'm constantly asked about, oh, but caste in India and Hindu right wing, and oh, Trump over there, and, you know, they have. And it's sort of like, we have a far right regime here. Have we missed this? And yet there is very little engagement with that. There's very little interest in countering that. And I think if we are looking forward, hopefully in the next week, I'm keeping fingers crossed, and it's not just presidential, but all the way down ballot, we'll see a shift. I think Obama's presidency has shown that, you know, as long as the GOP also are in control of the Senate, very little can be done. So it needs to be the Congress, it needs to be Senate, it needs to be all the way down ballot that the shift happens. But more than that, we're going to have to then think about how to make the change here, how to resist, how to learn from places like the US so we can bring it back here. I'm, you know, for someone who's qualified as left rather than actually ever qualifying myself as left, I'm always kind of fascinated, going, why is it that there isn't enough happening? This country has all the reasons we should be strongly pulling together a Labour solidarity across the board, and yet we're not doing it.
Yeah.
So to me, that's the most important challenge now.
And Sunny, the reason why I said over to you is because I knew you would just pick up the thread and run with it. And I also know that you are someone who spent your entire life building solidarity with people around the world. And I think your question is so key and so essential to understanding how much swift action we see in the UK, because I think part of the challenge for us here in this country is that many people feel exhausted, they feel terrified, and they are being pitted against each other. And this is the way of the political system around the world. We've already mentioned these countries with the so-called strongmen. It's all about dividing you into categories and making you understand that you can only have more if he or she has less. And this has been going on forever and a day, as we know, throughout world history. But I think that other countries around the world, like my roots are in Pakistan, we have a very strong, deep, rich tradition of bringing people together through our protest movements. And we had that once upon a time in the UK, I think, to a degree, but I think that has to be rebuilt again. And one of the things I'm always struck about is that there is no broad, intersectional, representative anti-racism movement in this country. This is a shocking shame that we don't have it, and we have to build it. It's way overdue, but we need to build it. So Sydette, I'm going to give the last words to you. If anybody else has any questions to ask, please do put them forward. I've had some comments about how much people have enjoyed listening to this conversation. What I really admire, there's many things I admire about the Fabian Women's Network, but one of them is the fact that we are very, I think we're getting better at opening space and holding space as well. And I think these are two things. The left is good at opening space, not so good at holding the space, but that's what we've done this evening. And we've created a nuanced conversation that, you know, people have been actively listening to, women primarily listening to this conversation. So I think there's something to learn there from that as well. So thank you to everybody who's participated in the conversation this evening, not just the panelists, but everybody who's here. So Sydette, over to you for the final word.
That's enough. Thank you. I think one of the things that I wanted to bring up is the idea of identity politics, and it's my own personal because it is identity politics when anyone looks like me or you or Sunny or Lisa. It is not identity politics when they look like Trump or Johnson. Anything that goes to that end, this is identity politics. They're just doing different identity politics. And what is something that I put forth as we watch tomorrow with bated breath and various levels of coping is tomorrow is the beginning, it's not the end. Whoever is elected, whatever happens tomorrow, there will be more work to be done on Tuesday. And what kind of work is what the question is. We're looking at these people just to be like, what are the conditions we have to be, what are the conditions we'll be under as we elect to do this work? Because to be realistic, the civil war is already happening. The culture wars aren't the thing. Culture wars would be culture wars to me are, do you prefer Monet or Manet? Culture wars are not, does your feeling about someone's, how they are born and how they live affect whether they eat or sleep or live? That's not a culture war to me, that's a war. People are trying to decide whether people deserve to live or die based on how they feel about their existence. That's not something that can continue. It's something that we have dealt with in a long way. But the most important thing to think about is I am pulling for a Biden-Harris win. I am. Whether or not that's my politics or whether or not support their party, it is the best conditions I can think of to do the work. And I also think that it comes back to the idea of when support of people becomes heavily politicized, everyone must be an activist. I often blanch at activism because I was kind of like, I'm a librarian and a civil tech person. The activism I have is going, okay, why doesn't this work? And I'm not going to accept that answer. That to many people is active, and we need more of it. But I am also in the tradition of, I came home from where I was living to be with my mother for this election and in this time, and she's going to get up at 5 a.m. to walk people to the polls. That is the work. That is just as valuable, or if not more valuable, as anything that I do in theory. And to build these coalitions and to do these work, we have to focus not just on our superstars and our celebrities, but on our people. Because at the end of the day, the bulk of that work is going to be carried by those people. And if I must live in these times, I am honored to live and to do work with the people that I know, and more importantly, the people that I am seeing who are coming to it every day. And in the best conditions of tomorrow, all I can say is that we will have much more opportunity to do more work. And that is what I hope for.
Well, I think that is a beautiful summing up of where we are, and a very hopeful one, and also one that absolutely recognizes that I always say this because it's true, we stand on the shoulders of giants. We do this work for everyone, for our ancestors. We do this work for those who will come after us as well. This is why we do the work. And your point about everyone must be an activist, I think, is the takeaway message here. We know how much is at stake. We've discussed it this evening. We understand what's at stake, but it is also for each of us to step up and take responsibility as well, and to play our part. And I think that's the message that's come through loud and clear. So Sydette, we send love to you and your family and to all people in the United States of America who are standing firm against everything that has been going on for hundreds of years, but everything that has been mainstreamed in particular over the last horrific few years. Sunny, we thank you for your continuous and steadfast solidarity that you show. You never flinch ever, and you remain strong and steadfast. And I know that comes at a price as well, so thank you. And we'd like to thank Lisa Nandy, who had to leave us slightly early, but we'd like to thank her for her brilliant analysis and for being with us this evening. And I'd like to thank the sisters at the Fabian Women's Network for enabling this discussion to take place. And just to say to everybody who's listening in as well, the next few hours, days and months are not going to be easy, we know that. But I think if we can act on some of the very wise words that have come from these sisters this evening, then that's what we need to do. We just need to take care of each other. Self-care is really important, but also just take care of the people around us. That's a revolutionary act in itself, quite frankly. So stay safe and stay well, and thank you for being here this evening, and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.